Good evening. Welcome to the 6th installment of the St. Ambrose Academy Spotlight Lecture Series, sponsored by Children's Dental Center of Madison. If you've missed any of our previous talks, you can check out the recordings at ambroseacademy.org/spotlight. We also had a fantastic parent pop-up where a few current parents had a casual conversation about what it's like to be a St. Ambrose family. These are fantastic ways to get to know this community more, and I encourage you to take a look at this at St. Ambrose Academy, ambroseacademy.org/pop-up. Before I begin, I also encourage you to ask any questions about tonight's topic. I'll be glad to answer them toward the end of my talk, so please do type those questions into the comment section. My name is Mary Skemp, and I'm going to be talking tonight about my experiences teaching Dante's Inferno to 9th and 10th graders here at St. Ambrose Academy. So as such, this is going to be a very introductory lecture on Dante's Inferno, like I do with the 9th and 10th graders. So I apologize ahead of time to anybody who's read the Inferno or who is a big fan of Dante already. Hopefully the new interesting questions that come up from the 9th and 10th graders will give you a fresh perspective on this amazing poem. So first, as I do with the students, I like to talk about Dante the man. Dante is the main character of the Inferno. He is this lost soul going through a pilgrimage through the Christian afterlife, Inferno, purgatory, and then paradise. He's also the narrator who is narrating this journey retrospectively. He's been through it and he's telling the story about how he went through it. And of course, he is the author. So Dante is very, very present and has this kind of triple relationship to the poem. So it's important to know who he is. Dante Alighieri was born in Florence, Italy in 1265. So we're at the end of the 13th century. When he was still a teenager, he started writing poetry and exploring new poetic forms. He also was reaching out to other like-minded souls in Florence. And the product of this early poetic exploration and these collaborations that he established was a new style of poetry, was innovation in poetry at the time. It's what he called later il dolce stil nuovo, the sweet new style. For my purposes here, what I'm interested in this sweet new style is what is sometimes called the performative aspect of it. What Dante is interested in his poetry is to bring his readers along on the emotional journey that he's creating in his poem. So performative in that sense, he wants you to feel what he's feeling at the same time. His poetry aims to recreate in you what is happening in me. And this performative aspect of his poetry is going to be very important as we move into the study of the comedy, the Inferno and the comedy. So when he's in his 20s, Dante decides to publish a collection of his poems. He calls it La Vita Nuova, or the New Life. And he accompanies his poems with commentary. There are two kinds of commentaries in La Vita Nuova. There are autobiographical commentaries and there's theological commentaries. And the autobiographical commentaries are interesting because they are focused on the woman who is the poetic inspiration, his muse, if you would. Her name is Beatrice. And we learn a lot about what she means to Dante in La Vita Nuova. And I'm going to read a passage from the Encyclopedia Britannica, just summarizing the information that we get in La Vita Nuova about Beatrice, Dante's muse. So I quote, La Vita Nuova describes Dante's first sight of Beatrice when they are both 9 years of age, her salutation when they are 18, Dante's expedients to conceal his love for her, the crisis experienced when Beatrice withholds her greeting, Dante's anguish when he perceives that she is making light of him, his determination to rise above anguish and sing only of his lady's virtues, anticipations of her death and her actual death, Dante's mourning, the temptation of the sympathetic Donna Gentile, the young woman who temporarily replaces Beatrice, and Beatrice's final triumph and apotheosis. And in the last chapter, Dante's determination to write at some time later about her that which has never been written of any woman. There are two things that I want to take out of this information that we have about Beatrice. The first is that we see in the progression of the information that we get from her is that Dante has a shift, right? So if he's writing initially poetry that expresses his emotions, and they are the emotions mostly of the suffering lover in this unrequited love, he turns away from that. He tries to really intentionally move away from the expression of his suffering to focus in on his muse, to focus in on Beatrice, and to focus in on specifically her virtues. So his poetry is going to move towards singing her virtues, and eventually he is going to create or give to her, if you would, a divine status within his poetic outwork. And this is the Beatrice that we meet in the comedy. Beatrice is his savior in the comedy. She's the one who comes down from heaven to ask the poet Virgil to come out of limbo and meet Dante and take him on this pilgrimage to save him. And she herself will be his guide through heaven, through paradise once he gets there. The idea of elevating the poetic muse to a divine status also gives insight into how Dante truly understands his poetic endeavor, what he really wants to do. His theological commentary on his poems at this young age signals this shift that will only be fully realized in the Divine Comedy, right? Where he writes that which has never been written before of any woman in a performative that specifically the reader will be closer to heaven by the end of this pilgrimage. So that's kind of the poetic history that I want the students to take into the reading of the Inferno. But there's also another part of Dante's personal life that it's important to understand moving into it, and that's his political life before he writes the Divine Comedy. So Dante was a politician. He was active in Florentine politics and actually served a term as a prior, which was the highest political office in the city-state of Florence. The Florentine politics is a little complicated, and I don't really go into much detail with the students. The details are not so important for our purposes, but it's good to know that it exists, that what parties exist and what alliances Dante personally makes, because it has a very large impact on his life eventually. So just to give a quick overview, there were two political parties. This is before Dante got into politics, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. By the time Dante is involved in politics, the Guelphs had taken power and kicked the Ghibellines out. Dante was a Guelph. His family was a family of Guelphs. As he was getting into politics, though, there was another division that came about, another partisanship that happened within the Guelph Party. It split and became the White Guelph Party versus the Black Guelph Party. Dante was a white Guelph, right? And so in 1302, Dante is sent on a diplomatic mission to Rome with two other Florentines. And while he's there, the Black Guelphs seize power and boot the White Guelphs out. Dante himself is accused of treason, and he is put on trial in absentia, condemned to death. So basically, he's put into exile. And indeed, Dante never is able to go back to Florence after this time. From 1302, when he left for Rome, to his death in 1321, Dante leads a relatively nomadic life in northern Italy, never really finding another home for himself. So he's in exile, right? Obviously, he's forced to leave politics. He never finds another political home. And out of this necessity, he shifts his intellectual focus, right? It kind of unburdens him of the focus on the local, the narrow city politics, and allows him to think larger, right? To think of the greater world. to think about, rather the short-term issues of partisanship, to think about really the long-term effects and the long-term conditions of partisanship and the damage that that partisanship does to community. So Dante's exile gives him the opportunity to examine larger questions from an outside perspective. He's no longer writing just for himself, but he's writing for a larger purpose, for the greater world. And for Dante, this world is a broken world. It's divided in partisanship, and it is suffering. So Dante uses his political exile to explore what he sees as the spiritual exile, that humanity is suffering. So those are the two things that the kids have to know. They have to know about the poetic progression, and they have to know that Dante's involvement in politics ends up in his exile. Now, so he's in this space now where he's ready to write the Divine Comedy, and he really spends that time, the rest of his life in exile, working on the Divine Comedy. So let's talk about the comedy itself. The work contains 3 books, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. When I introduced the comedy to the freshman class this year, I said, yes, we have these 3 books, but we're only going to read one of them. We're just going to read the first one, the Inferno. And true to St. Ambrose form, I had a student raise her hand with her eyes on the right prize saying, why aren't we reading Paradise? Or even Purgatory for that matter? Why would we read the Inferno? So I had 2 questions for her, or 2 answers for her question. The first was, it is often said about the Divine Comedy that you're only truly ready to read the Divine Comedy after having already read the Divine Comedy, right? So that to understand Paradise, you have to have gone through hell, right? Now, the reverse could be true too. We'll have a deeper understanding of hell once we've been through Paradise, but I figure we could start at the beginning. So off we go onto the Inferno. And I also say the other reason I give is I think the Inferno is a little bit more accessible than the other 2, and dare I say, entertaining. And I think that the students agree with me when they get to the end of it. Okay. So each of the 3 books are divided into chapters called canti. And the Inferno has an introductory canto and then 33 canti. The Purgatorio and the Paradise each have 33 canti, so for a total of 100 chapters. In each canto, the poem is divided into 3-line stanzas. They're called terzina. And even the rhyme scheme has a pattern of 3 in it. You can see it here on the next slide. In the original Italian, the 2nd line of the first stanza rhymes with the 1st and the 3rd lines of the following stanza. And this is a pattern that continues to the end of the canto, where in a 4-line stanza it is completed. This pattern is called the terza rima. The geography of the Inferno is also structured in thirds, as you can see in this visual representation of Dante's hell. There are 3 main divisions in hell. At the top, and it goes from less serious sins to more serious sins in Dante. So at the top, we have the sins of incontinence. In the middle, the violent sins. And at the very bottom, we have the sins of fraud, both simple fraud and then treachery at the very, very bottom. Okay. Dante's Inferno is designed as a descending funnel of circles, and there are 9 circles total. With this precise construction built on the number 3, Dante fits perfectly within the ethos of the medieval mind, which seeks to order the rather chaotic and unpredictable world around it. C.S. Lewis writes in his book, The Discarded Image, at his most characteristic, medieval man was not a dreamer, nor a wanderer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a builder of systems. And I would say that even though your typical freshman or sophomore in high school is very much a dreamer, they have a very strong appreciation for the nicely structured universe of Dante's afterlife. It makes it a little easier to get through. They do take issue, however, sometimes with the way that Dante organizes the sin within his construction of hell. And I'm going to talk more about that later. So Dante uses medieval numerology to emphasize certain points. And this is especially clear with the number 3, which is present everywhere in its multiples, as you see. We can even think back to La Vita Nuova, where Dante says he and Beatrice were 9 years old when they met, and then he says he's 18 when he had another meeting with her. So this 3, of course, represents the Trinity. And with this emphasis on the number 3, Dante clearly encloses his universe of the afterlife within the Trinitarian God. So if Dante the pilgrim starts his journey lost and afraid, and Dante the narrator knows that he's eventually going to get to heaven, so that there is hope, Dante the author wants to assure the reader, wants to give the reader absolute certainty that everything's going to be okay well within this Trinitarian framework, the framework of God's love, basically. So at the beginning of the poem, however, Dante, the character, is far from understanding that he is surrounded by God's love. He is, and I read the first 3 lines of the poem, midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. In the first 2 lines of this poem, the reader is invited to understand that although this poem is about Dante, right? Dante is everywhere in this poem. It's about him, and it's about his particular moral crisis that he's going through. It still pertains to all of us. This is our life. This is the journey of our life. This journey is universal. And so we are invited to accompany him on the pilgrimage and understand it as our own as we follow his emotional and intellectual evolution through the afterlife. When Dante enters the gate of hell with his guide, the poet Virgil, he reads the words that are inscribed over the archway, which indicate that God is present even here in the depths of hell. And most people have heard what is the most famous line of the poem. It's the last line of this inscription over the archway, the line, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." But there's another really important message that is conveyed to the souls in this inscription. And I read, "Justice moved my maker on high, divine power made me, wisdom supreme and primal love." Dante says to Virgil after reading this sign, "Master, these words, their meaning for me is hard." And while it's easy to understand that Dante is responding to this last line, right, the whole idea that hope has been banished is a hard thing to take, it's equally important to understand that he's responding to this idea of God's justice and wisdom and love making this place. So the horrors of hell are a product of God's love. And part of Dante's journey through the afterlife, especially in the Inferno, is to come to an understanding of that, to come to understand how this place is a place of God's love. And he has a hard time. He really feels sorry for the sinners, especially at the beginning. You know, he pities them quite a bit. He faints at one point, full of compassion. He gets excited about talking to mentors of his or heroes, you know, literary heroes or historical heroes. And so he doesn't always understand that he needs to distance himself from that and accept God's justice and accept that it is a reflection also of God's love. Likewise, the students in the class who accompany Dante through this trip through hell do not always immediately grasp why Dante designs hell the way he does. So if Dante has a hard time understanding God's justice, the students have sometimes a hard time accepting and understanding Dante's concept of justice too. So again, more on that a little later. But before I go in that direction, I want to talk about Dante's first encounter with a sinner. This is in the second circle of hell. This first circle is limbo. And this first direct encounter with one of the condemned souls introduces several important parameters that mark many of Dante's encounters as he makes his way through hell. So, having left the ancient philosophers and poets in limbo, Dante and Virgil enter the second circle of hell, and they see all these souls being blown about in this incessant wind. The sensory experience for him is this really loud wind, and there's the laments from the sinners as they are just thrown about in uncontrolled torment. Virgil points out to him that this is indeed the place of eternal torment for those souls who died in the state of sin of lust, or as Dante puts it, those whom love had parted from our life. He wants to speak to some of them. He asks Virgil if he can speak to a couple of them. And I want to read you a passage of what the sinner who speaks says to him when she begins talking to Dante. Her name is Francesca Rimini, and she's standing there with her lover Paolo. And she says to Dante, "O living creature, gracious and kind, that comes through the somber air to visit us, who stained the world with blood. If the King of the universe were our friend, we would pray that he might give you peace, since you show pity for our grievous plight. We long to hear and speak of that which you desire to speak and know here while the wind has calmed. On that shore where the river Po with all its tributaries flows to a peaceful flow, there I was born. Love, quick to kindle in the gentle heart, seized this man from the fair form taken from me. The way of it afflicts me still. Love, which absolves no one beloved from loving, seized me so strongly with his charm that, as you see, it has not left me yet. Love brought us to one death. Cain waits for him who quenched our lives." So after we read this beginning passage, I asked the students, what kind of language Francesca uses to talk to Dante. And they usually come up with the word poetic, and it is indeed very poetic. They talk about how polite she is to him and how eager she is to talk and accommodate his requests. And indeed, her language is an echo of the kind of poetry that Dante wrote in his life. She plies a language that would appeal very, very much to Dante, and Dante is taken in very much by her language. But there are a couple other points that I think are important to take away from this passage. The first comes from the original Italian, and we use a bilingual edition, so I asked the students to look over to the Italian to look at the beginning of her discourse and what she says. She says to him, she addresses him as animal grazioso et benigno, literally an animal. It's translated here as creature, but I think that word creature kind of hides a little bit the important lesson that we're supposed to learn here from Francesca's use of that word. As soon as she opens her mouth in this passage, she reveals that she sees the human person from its animalistic aspects. This is a reflection of how she herself succumbed to her animal instincts, allowing her passions to overcome her reason. And this reign of desire is characteristic of all the sins of incontinence at the beginning of, that are at the top of hell. Secondly, in her evocation of love, Francesca demonstrates that she has not taken full responsibility for her sin. 3 times she calls out love for having enticed her and her lover into sin, shifting the blame away from herself and onto the abstract, allegorical character of love. Francesca finds another scapegoat in her answer to Dante's request for more details. And I'm going to read this passage too, if you don't mind, on the next slide. She says, "One day, to pass the time in pleasure, we read of Lancelot, how love enthralled him. We were alone without the least misgiving. More than once that reading made our eyes meet and drained the color from our faces. Still, it was a single instant overcame us when we read how the longed-for smile was kissed by so renowned a lover. This man, who never shall be parted from me, all trembling, kissed me on my mouth. A Galeotto was the book, and he that wrote it. That day we read in it no further." So in this second passage, it's the book that becomes the culprit, right? She blames the book for the sin. It leads the lovers into sin by modeling that sin. The problem here, of course, is that in her own recounting of what happened, it's clear to the reader that Francesca and Paolo had plenty of opportunity to make other choices, right? That this wasn't an inevitable ending. And it's ironic that she says that they didn't read in it any further, because if they had read in it further, if they had read the book to the end, they would have learned a totally different lesson from it, which is that adultery never really ends up well for anybody involved. So they should have finished, right? Again, she's rejecting firmly any kind of moral responsibility for her sin. She calls out the book for being the main character in her downfall. And interestingly, her last line, that day we read in it no further, is a nod to St. Augustine's Confessions, where he narrates the moment when he's reading the Bible and finally arrives at a conversion. And he writes, "That day I read no further, nor was there further need." So Augustine doesn't need to read anymore that day because he has understood God's call. Whereas Francesca and Paolo needed to read more that day. Dante creates many inversions like this in hell. Dante's hell is a universe of perverse reversals. Unlike Augustine, right? Francesca has clearly understood nothing. And so she has subsequently pushed God away for eternity. So Dante is so moved by the story that he actually faints. And the students, too, have kind of a reaction to this story, a mixed reaction, especially after I tell them that Francesca and Paolo's story is a true story. Dante's readers would have been familiar with this sensational narrative. Francesca and Paolo were in-laws. Francesca was married to Paolo's brother, and the brother happened to walk in on their indiscretion, killing them on the spot. So these two sinners were given no chance for redemption, and that makes them a little bit more sympathetic to the students. And I can't help but believe that Dante really means for his readers to join him at the beginning of the narrative and feeling some compassion for these sinners, the sinners in the second circle. Dante, like Dante, they have to learn how hell is indeed a product of God's justice, God's wisdom, and again, although this is a little harder to understand, a product of God's love. So now I'm going to jump. I'm going to jump down to the 8th circle. The 8th circle is known as the Malebolge, and it's constructed, you can see here one visual image of it in with kind of ditches, right? So Malebolge means evil pocket. And if you can imagine, we've got this kind of circle of ditches that are going around, and Dante and Virgil are climbing over them. There are bridges that go over them and talking to the sinners below them. These are the sins of simple fraud. When we arrived in the Malebolge, this is when the first student raised her hand and started questioning Dante's organization of the sins in hell. So in the first pocket of the Malebolge, Dante puts the slanderers and the panderers. And in the second pocket, he puts the flatterers. And this student raised her hand and she said, you know, I think this is just Dante's weird thing, because who would put a flatterer lower down in hell than a murderer? Okay? So the murderers are up in the middle part of hell in the sins of violence. In fact, they're the first part in the 7th circle, which is the circle of the violent sins, right? So who would do that? Thus began our discussion on why Dante puts the sins of fraud in the lower parts of hell. And we focused our discussion on those first two Malebolge, and on top of that, we focused in on the Simonists, who are those who sold church offices for profit, and the bear raiders, or corrupt public officials, and finally those who are guilty of the sin of false counsel, the false counselors. And we tease out of each canto that thing which earns the sinners the punishments of the lowest circles of hell. There are two ideas that come out of this, two kind of themes that come through. And the first is that many of these sinners abused language. And Dante, poet and politician, understands language as one of the most sacred gifts that God gave to humanity. Those with a higher intellect, who have a deep understanding of the power of language and then abuse that power, merit Dante's scorn. But these sins are also most especially serious, according to Dante, because they affect a larger scope of people. And in so doing, the effect they have is to destroy human community. So Dante's exploration of the effects of partisanship finds full fruition at the bottom of hell. It's in the 9th circle where we see the worst of the worst. This is where the sin of treachery is punished. We have those who have betrayed family. We have those who have betrayed country or party. We have those who have betrayed friends. And finally, at the very, very bottom, we have those who have betrayed their rightful Lord. As you can see in this next slide, Satan is down there, frozen right in the middle of the lake of ice that he creates himself. He's got these bat-like wings on his shoulders, and he's constantly moving them, creating the cold air. Then that freezes the secretions, if you would, that come out of his 3 heads, his tears and his drool coming down. So he's created this frozen lake. And yes, Satan does have 3 heads. He's another perversion of the Trinity down there at the bottom. In his 3 mouths, he is eternally munching on the 3 iconic traitors. In his middle head, he has Judas Iscariot, and then on either side, we have Brutus and Cassius. So the betrayal of Christ and the betrayal of empire. So the perversion of God's greatest gifts to man and the way that those perversions destroy human community characterize the bottom of hell. And while most students seem satisfied with this analysis of of Dante's logic, if you would, many of them see in Dante's distribution of sins a pattern of him getting revenge on his worst persecutors. They think that he is putting people down in the lower parts of hell who were responsible for his exile. And they would not be totally wrong, I think. However, and more importantly, they would only be partially right. Because although this pilgrimage is about Dante the Pilgrim, it's also about you and me, the readers of the poem. Dante sincerely wants to lead his readers on a trip to heaven, bringing them closer to this goal. And a poem about personal vendetta would just not accomplish that, right? It's only understanding this poem and its universality that we can do it justice as readers. And I think I'm still working on some freshmen in that regards. So before I take questions, there's one other thing I'd like to share with you. I asked the students to do a project along with the reading of the Inferno, and that was to create their own hell. I asked them to take the 7 deadly sins or the 10 commandments and to make an arrangement of these sins within a configuration. They had to do some kind of visual of that, and they had to explain why they organized the sins in this particular way. They also had to give each sin a contrapasso, which is Dante's system of balancing the sin with the right punishment, right? And so they had to explain what the contrapasso was too for each of the sins that they did. On this first screen here, I had one student who actually decided to stick with Dante's hell, but kind of rearrange things in a way that made more sense to her. And I thought that she gave really an amazing amount of thought and insight into what she did here. So she has in the first part of hell, the lost innocence, the kind of the limbo area. The second part she calls the valley of wasted providence, sinners against self and others, living in this chasm of disunity, as she calls it. And then finally, what she does at the very bottom is she groups those sins that she sees. She calls it the valley of abandonment. She sees these sins as more directly against God. Okay, and I wanted to show you a couple other pictures just to give you an idea of the diversity that I get from the students. A lot of students like to use Legos to express their understanding of hell, and we get some that are very abstract, but really interestingly described. And we have some that are a little bit more literal with their the details that they use with their Lego figures. Really nicely done. In the next slide, we have the posters. We have beautiful posters that the students make. They put a lot of time on it. And then the next slide, we've got a couple books. And I wanted to show you these two. These two students decided to put gluttony at the top of hell. That's not unusual for students to see that as the least serious sin, least serious of the 7 deadly sins. We very rarely get students who agree with Dante and put lust as the least serious sin at the top of hell. Gluttony is much more popular. And then we have, let's see, we have a lot of, I got a number of PowerPoints. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull this one up. Let's see if we can bring that up. It's happening. I'm being told that it might happen. All right. This student called her hell the Inferno. So she's got some disagreements with Dante also. And I just wanted to share, if possible, we'll see if it works, one of her slides. I found it particularly creative, although there's a lot of creative examples that I get from the students. No, it's not going to happen. Darn it. All right, I'm just going to tell you what she did. She also put gluttony, I think, at the top, but her second circle was the circle of the sins of sloth. And their punishment, the contrapasso that she gave to the slothful, was to have them condemned to giving motivational speeches to all the devils in hell for eternity. So I just thought that was very clever. All right, so that is all I have to say tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, okay. So the first question is, what do you see as the advantage of how we do English here at St. Ambrose? So we try to teach in as much as possible a Socratic method, and it pulls the students into the discussion, right? So we start out by questions. What do you see in this text? You know, why is that important, do you think? Why did the author do this? And we kind of gather information from the students to show them how that information, gathering that information, can arrive eventually at a nice interpretation of the work. And the nice thing for me, honestly, is that I am often surprised at the insight and new ideas that I get, you know. So I'm not there imposing what I think. Well, sometimes I insist. Like I insist that Dante did not write that poem as a personal vendetta. I insist that. But it's great because, you know, the creative juices get going, and they really come up with some really wonderful ideas, the students do, that renew my own understanding of the literature as I teach it. So it's a very collaborative way of doing literature, and it's a joy to do it as a teacher. So another question regarding the English program. As a parent of an elementary student, I'm wondering how younger students progress from being enthusiastic readers of Percy Jackson and Diary of a Wimpy Kid to reading Dante's Inferno at St. Ambrose in high school. Is there a transitional period for students that start your program that leads them to appreciate and understand the classic? Well, I can say that our middle school program is actually very good for that. They're introduced to some really good literature at that, that's very much at their level. But challenges them to read really quality classic literature at that middle school level. Having said that, I'm not going to say that it's not hard for the students here. It's a challenge for them to take up the reading. I read Dante's Inferno with them in the context of English 2. English 2 is our medieval cycle. And we don't read anything that's not a challenge to read in cycle 2. Now, it's all really fun literature in the sense that it's full of knights and battles and you know, chivalric romance and travels through hell, and we all, you know, it's fun stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff that's fun to read. But part of what we're doing is exposing these students to the quality of literature, asking them to take ownership of it, asking them to read, asking them to put themselves out there and read, right? And and then see what we can get from it. Okay, so it's a process. There's no doubt that it's a process, and we work on it together, especially with the freshman class. We do a good amount of reading together in class. So we'll just read together and then talk about the text and continue reading as much as we can. But they definitely have to take ownership of this, and they definitely have to go out on a limb, because it's a challenge for them. And they succeed. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about it, right? They're successful. They get through these works, and they write interesting papers about them, and they write essay exams, and they write beautiful things. And so I know that they are learning, and that's really, it's great to see. So what are your favorite texts to teach at St. Ambrose Academy? That's kind of hard, because it always happens to be the text that I'm reading at any given time. Just as a little background, I came into this with a background in French literature. I do have a degree in English literature from way back when. I've been teaching at St. Ambrose for 4 years. And so I had to kind of come back to my background in English literature, and was reading these things again after having not read them for a very long time, and reading some things for the first time that I was going to be teaching. And every time I read something, I thought, oh my gosh, this is such a great book. Now I know why this is such a great book, right? Why they teach this. So the simple answer, I guess, is that my favorite is what I happen to be reading with the students at any given time. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for the Inferno. I love to read the Inferno with the students. So no more questions. That was it. Okay, well, thank you very much. I do want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed this year's faculty speaker series and getting to know St. Ambrose a little bit more. That being said, virtual events don't quite capture the impact of our rich Catholic classical curriculum and close-knit community have on students. So if you're interested in getting a closer look, we encourage you to set up an in-person visit or a student shadow day. Enrollment is currently open for new students, so if you have been intrigued by what you've heard about St. Ambrose here, please reach out. We can share answers to any questions about academics, tuition, assistance, extracurriculars, sports, and much more. You can call us 608-827-5863 or send us a message at ambroseacademy.org/contact. Thank you again for joining me and for your interest in St. Ambrose Academy. We hope to see you again soon. God bless.